I still remember the sound of my own breath that night, slow and shaky, like the walls of my little house in Ohio were listening to me confess a life I never chose, but somehow survived. Before I even tell you my name, I want to know something from you. I want to know how far my voice has traveled. If you're listening to me right now, tell me in the comments where you're from, which city, which town, which lonely corner of this country heard my story tonight, because sometimes an old woman just needs to know she's not talking to empty air. My name is Margaret Lewis. I'm 60 years old, and this isn't a story I ever planned to tell strangers, but silence has a way of eating you alive when you let it sit too long. I had one child, just one, a son named Daniel, and I loved him in a way that wrapped around my bones. When Daniel was 8, his father worked the night shift at a manufacturing plant, the kind of place that smelled like oil, hot metal, and tired men trying to make rent. One winter night, when the roads were slick and the sky felt heavy, his father collapsed on the factory floor. By the time I reached the hospital, snow clinging to my coat and my fingers numb from gripping the steering wheel too hard, the doctor's eyes told me everything before his mouth did. In America, they call it a workplace accident. To me, it was the moment my life split clean in two. Overnight, I went from being someone's wife to being a widow with a child who kept asking when daddy was coming home. Nobody prepares you for explaining death to an 8-year-old while your own chest feels like it's caving in. After that, the house felt colder, not just from the Ohio winters, but from the absence of a man who used to whistle in the mornings. Pipes froze more than once. Some mornings I scraped ice from the inside of the windows before waking my son for school. I became everything for Daniel. His mother, his father, his shield. I cleaned houses in quiet suburbs where women my age talked about Florida vacations and granite countertops while I scrubbed their floors, nodding politely like my life looked anything like theirs. I worked a diner off the highway, the smell of grease clinging to my hair, pouring burnt coffee for tired truckers who called me sweetheart and asked why I never smiled. There were nights I pretended I wasn't hungry so Daniel could have seconds. Mornings I stitched his ripped jeans instead of buying new ones. Winters where I kept the heat low and told him sweaters indoors were just part of being tough. When the school sent home permission slips for field trips I couldn't afford, I lied and said he didn't want to go. Every sacrifice felt small compared to the promise I made myself, that my son would never feel abandoned the way I did. Daniel grew fast, taller than me by 15, quiet in that way boys get when they start understanding how heavy the world can be. Some nights he'd sit at the kitchen table while I counted tips, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence. He'd slide his homework aside just to talk, asking if I was tired, asking if we were going to be okay. When he got his first paycheck from a part-time job, he pushed it across the table toward me and said, "We're a team, Mom." I laughed and cried at the same time, because in that moment, all the pain felt worth it. After high school, he became a machine operator at a manufacturing plant, long shifts, loud floors, honest work that followed him home in grease-stained hands and aching shoulders. I was proud in a way that hurt, the kind of pride that fills your chest until you have to sit down. I imagined his future quietly, a good woman, a calm house, Sunday dinners where the noise was laughter instead of worry. That's probably why the evening he showed up with a suitcase and a smile that felt rushed knocked the air out of me. He said, "Mom, I've got a surprise," and before I could ask anything, a young woman stepped into my home like she already knew where everything belonged. Her name was Rachel. She looked around the living room, the old couch, the family photos, and smiled in a way I couldn't quite read. Daniel told me they were married. Just like that. No warning, no conversation, no chance for a mother to be part of the biggest decision of her son's life. I smiled because that's what mothers do when their hearts crack in places no one can see. That night I cried in the bathroom with the faucet running, grieving dreams I'd built silently for years, then washed my face and told myself love means letting go. For a while, Rachel played the part beautifully. She hugged me in front of Daniel, called me mom with a voice sweet enough to fool anyone listening, talked about family values and respect, and brought me coffee in the mornings when he was around. Once, she laughed and said, "We'll have to get you used to how things work now," and I brushed it off as nerves, as adjustment, as nothing. I wanted to believe her kindness so badly that I ignored the small things, the looks when Daniel left for work, the way her smile dropped the second the door closed. At first, it was nothing anyone would call abuse. Extra chores, comments about how I folded towels wrong, sighs when dinner wasn't exactly how she liked it. She complained about utility bills, about how expensive it was to carry extra people in a house, about how women my age should know better than to waste electricity or water. In America, they tell you family tension is normal, so I swallowed my words and kept cleaning, cooking, hoping. One afternoon, it turned sharp over something stupid. The washing machine set on the wrong cycle. She snapped, told me I was outdated, said I was lucky she tolerated me at all. I stood there with detergent on my hands, the machine rattling loudly, hearing every year of my life echo back at me, and I said nothing, because love makes you quiet in the worst ways. I told myself she'd change, that once she really knew me things would soften. 5 years passed like that, then 6, nearly 7, and I began to notice the pattern that hurt more than yelling ever could. When Daniel was home, Rachel transformed. She laughed louder, spoke gentler, told him how lucky he was to have such a caring mother. She insisted I rest, waved me away from chores, served me the best food like it was a show meant just for him. The moment his truck pulled out of the driveway, her voice changed. Orders replaced kindness, cold plates replaced warm meals, insults slid in like they belonged there. I realized then that her respect was a performance, and I was the only one who ever saw behind the curtain. If you've ever stayed quiet for someone you loved, if you've ever felt invisible in your own home, tell me in the comments if you understand this kind of pain, because knowing you're not alone can keep an old woman breathing. I didn't tell my son. I was afraid of breaking his marriage, afraid he'd think I was imagining things, afraid of losing the only person I had left. So I stayed small, telling myself peace was worth the cost. But one night, after Daniel left for a double shift and the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Rachel leaned close to me in the kitchen and said, almost casually, "Don't forget whose house this really is now." That was when I understood something I still haven't said out loud. That silence wasn't protecting my family anymore. It was slowly erasing me, and that realization followed me to bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing my story had only just begun. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house creak the way it always did when the heat kicked on, wondering how a place that once felt safe could suddenly feel like borrowed space. Rachel's words stayed with me, not loud, not angry, just calmly planted, like she had moved a line inside my head and expected me to adjust. Morning came the same way it always had, too early, my body waking before my mind was ready. I moved through the kitchen quietly, careful with every sound, brewing coffee the way I had for decades. When Daniel walked in, rubbing sleep from his eyes before another long shift, Rachel was already there, cheerful, wrapped around him like warmth. She asked what he wanted for breakfast, touched his arm, laughed softly. Then she looked at me and said, almost kindly, that I was already up again, that I really should try to rest more at my age. Daniel frowned, worried, told me I didn't need to push myself, told me I could slow down now. I smiled and nodded, because explaining felt heavier than silence. When he left, the house tightened. Rachel's voice changed the way it always did, not cruel, just clipped. She reminded me about the trash, said the neighbors had complained again, even though I knew they hadn't. She pushed dishes toward me and said she had things to do, places to be. Days folded into each other like that. Criticism slipped into conversation the way weather does, constant, unavoidable. She commented on how slow I moved, how much space I took, how I still lived like everything cost too much. She laughed sometimes, told me to relax, said this wasn't the old days anymore, like my caution was something outdated I should be embarrassed by. Other times she went quiet, cold, moving through the house without acknowledging me at all. That silence hurt more than shouting. I started shrinking my routines to avoid her moods, timing my showers, double-checking lights, measuring water like it was rationed. I ate less, partly because my appetite faded, partly because every meal came with commentary. Too bland, too heavy, too unhealthy. When Daniel was home, everything flipped. Rachel sat close to me on the couch, asked about my day, told him I'd been resting like he wanted. Watching them together felt like standing outside my own life, close enough to see it. Too far away to touch it. Daniel noticed things, the way people do when they care but don't look too closely. He mentioned I seemed thinner, quieter. Rachel always answered first. I was tired. I worried too much. I wasn't used to change. She laughed it off, said his mom just needed time. He kissed my forehead and told me not to stress. I told myself this was temporary, that families grow into each other, that patience would smooth the edges. Then one afternoon, something shifted in a way I couldn't undo. Rachel handed me a list of chores longer than usual and said they were having friends over, people from Daniel's work, and the house needed to look right. I cleaned until my back burned, scrubbing floors, wiping baseboards, polishing surfaces no one ever touched. When the guests arrived, Rachel introduced me proudly as Daniel's mother and joked about how helpful it was to have extra hands around the house. Help. I stood there holding a tray of snacks while people smiled politely, and in that moment I understood I had been reduced to a role I hadn't agreed to. Later that night, after the house emptied and Daniel went to bed exhausted, Rachel walked through the living room, pointed at the carpet, and said I'd missed a spot, that it reflected badly on her. There was no shouting, no drama, just a quiet correction that settled deep. Something inside me hardened then, a realization that this wasn't adjustment or misunderstanding. It was control wrapped in courtesy. From that day on, she started moving my things, small at first. A chair shifted, photos boxed up, my favorite mug gone. She said it was clutter, said the house needed a cleaner look. I began to feel like a guest who had overstayed, tiptoeing through rooms that once held my life. If you've ever felt yourself disappearing inch by inch to keep peace, if you've ever stayed quiet because speaking felt dangerous, tell me in the comments if you understand this feeling. Because knowing someone else has survived it matters more than you might think. I didn't tell my son. I told myself love meant endurance, that protecting him meant swallowing my own hurt. But every night, lying awake, listening to the house breathe around me, I felt something new growing under the sadness. Not hope. Not courage. A slow, steady understanding that this wasn't just about discomfort anymore. It was about erasure. And that knowledge sat with me in the dark, heavy and unavoidable, as I realized how far I'd already been pushed without anyone noticing. I didn't notice it all at once. That's the part people never understand. Nothing was taken from me in a single moment. It happened the way paint peels from an old porch, slow, quiet, almost polite. One day I realized the drawers in my bedroom were lighter. Not empty. Just lighter. A sweater gone. A pair of shoes I hadn't worn in a while. Small things. Things no one would call theft. Rachel said she was organizing, said the house felt crowded, said extra things made it hard to breathe. She smiled when she said it, like she was doing me a favor. I told myself it didn't matter. I was old. I didn't need much. That was the first lie I learned to tell on her behalf. The second came when my world began to shrink to the size of whatever room she decided I was allowed to exist in that day. The living room felt too loud for me now. The kitchen was busy when she cooked. My bedroom door stayed open always. Privacy, she said, was how accidents happened. Daniel nodded when she said it. He always nodded. He worked long hours. He was tired. I learned how to disappear without leaving the house. I learned which floorboards creaked and which ones didn't. I learned how to eat quietly, how to move like I was borrowing space that didn't belong to me anymore. The first time I went to the store and my card declined, I stood there holding a carton of eggs and a loaf of bread, listening to the machine beep like it was embarrassed for me. The cashier looked up with that tight smile people get when they don't want to be rude, but don't want to get involved either. I laughed it off, said banks mess up all the time. When I got home, Rachel already knew. She always knew. She said it was probably for the best. At my age, she explained, people made mistakes with money. She said she'd handle the accounts from now on so I wouldn't stress myself out. Stress, she said, was dangerous for seniors. It didn't feel like control at first. It felt like relief. That's how it works. You hand over one thing because you're tired, and then another because you're grateful, and then another because it would be awkward to ask for it back. I stopped seeing statements. Stopped touching cash. When I asked Daniel for $20 to buy shampoo, he hesitated just a second too long. Rachel answered for him. Said I already had some upstairs. I didn't correct her. I went upstairs and added water to the bottle until it rattled when I shook it. She laughed softly. the first time she did it in front of other people. We were at a neighbor's barbecue, one of those forced summer things with paper plates and polite conversations. Someone asked how I was doing. Before I could answer, Rachel squeezed my arm and said I'd been a little fragile lately. She said it kindly, sweetly, like concern wrapped in sugar. I tried to speak. She kept going. Said I got confused when I was tired. Said it was normal. Everyone nodded. No one looked at me anymore. They looked at her. I stood there holding a warm soda, feeling like a coat someone had forgotten to hang up. After that, it happened more often. At the doctor's office. At church. In front of Daniel. I was fragile lately. I got confused when I was tired. We're looking into senior assistance programs. Each sentence landed like a soft pillow over my face, gentle, persistent. Impossible to argue without looking exactly like what she said I was. When I tried to explain myself to Daniel later, the words came out wrong. They always do when you've been shrinking for too long. He kissed my forehead and told me not to worry so much. Said Rachel was just trying to help. I watched him walk away and felt something cold settle in my chest. It wasn't heartbreak. It was clarity. The suggestion came on a Tuesday. No argument. No raised voices. Rachel sat across from me at the kitchen table with a pamphlet folded neatly in her hands. She said some people thrived in communities designed for their needs. She said it might give Daniel and her space to focus on their future. She said I deserved peace. She never said the word leave. She didn't have to. The house felt smaller than it ever had. My things were already gone. My money already managed. My voice already translated into something safer for everyone else to hear. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and understood something that changed the shape of my breathing. Control had turned into isolation, and isolation had quietly become a plan. I saw the line in front of me, clear as day. On one side were the people who disappeared quietly. On the other were the people who decided they would not. This was the point where people either disappeared quietly or decided they would not. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. My heart didn't race. It slowed. My mind did the same. Outside, the house settled the way it always did at night, full of sounds that meant nothing to me anymore. Inside, something locked into place. Not anger. Not yet. Something steadier. Something patient. The kind of thing that waits. And for the first time since Rachel moved in, I stopped wondering how to survive the days ahead and started thinking about what it would take to stay. I didn't rush after that night. People expect movement after a decision, some loud shift, some dramatic step. That's not how it works when you've been quiet for a long time. Silence teaches you patience. I kept doing what I'd been doing, just a little more awake. I stopped reacting and started observing. The way Rachel timed things. The way she spoke for me before I opened my mouth. The way Daniel trusted whatever sounded calm and reasonable in the moment. I understood something uncomfortable then. I hadn't been erased. I'd been rewritten. And rewrites always leave fingerprints if you know where to look. The first change was invisible. I stopped apologizing in my head. When Rachel told me I'd left a light on, I didn't build a defense inside myself. When she reminded Daniel how tired I got, I didn't rehearse explanations after they went to bed. That quiet space gave me room to remember. Numbers came back to me. Dates. The name of the bank printed faintly on the back of my old card. The branch Daniel chose years ago because it was less crowded and closer to the highway. Memory sharpened when fear loosened its grip. I asked Daniel for the car one afternoon. Just errands, I said. He paused, keys still in his hand, like the question had surprised him. For a second, something crossed his face. Not suspicion. Discomfort. Rachel glanced up from her phone and said it was fine. He was working late anyway. The moment passed. Daniel tossed me the keys with a small smile, but he watched me longer than usual as I walked out. That look stayed with me. It told me he wasn't blind. He was just choosing the smoother road. I drove slow, windows cracked, radio low. The bank lobby smelled like carpet cleaner and burnt coffee. Everything there was designed to make people feel calm, contained. The girl at the desk smiled like this wasn't the first complicated story she'd heard that week. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't demand anything. I asked questions the way confused people were allowed to ask questions. I nodded when things were explained, even when they weren't. That silence screamed louder than any argument ever could. Over the next few days, rules tightened. I wasn't allowed to walk Lily to school anymore because mornings were too emotional. I wasn't supposed to tuck her in because routines mattered. Karen said all of this with a soft smile, like she was doing me a favor by letting me stay involved at all. I started feeling like a guest in a house I helped build. The notebook became my anchor. I wrote everything down, not just words, but patterns, timing, tone. I wasn't building a case yet. I was holding on to reality. One evening, Karen cornered me in the kitchen while Michael was outside on a call. She told me I needed to accept my role, that clinging would only make things worse. She said if I truly loved Lily, I'd step back and let her parents lead. Her voice never rose. That's what made it terrifying. She wasn't angry. She was certain. Lily heard part of that conversation too. Later, she asked me if I was going to leave. That question hit me harder than anything else so far. I told her I wasn't going anywhere, but the truth was I didn't know how much choice I really had. Karen was tightening control through systems, through professionals, through concern wrapped in kindness. Michael was slipping further into passivity, convincing himself this was temporary, that things would calm down if everyone just behaved. I saw what he couldn't yet. This wasn't a phase. It was a takeover. The breaking point came faster than I expected. One afternoon, Karen told me Lily would be staying overnight at her sister's again, indefinitely. She framed it as stability, said kids need consistency during emotional growth. Michael didn't even look at me when he agreed. Lily stood frozen between us, waiting for someone to say something different. I felt a clarity settle over me then, sharp and cold. Waiting wasn't protecting Lily anymore. It was abandoning her. That night, after everyone went to bed. I locked myself in the bathroom and turned the fan on high. I called the number the girl at the bank had circled. I didn't tell my story. I asked what protections existed. The woman on the other end spoke evenly, like this was familiar territory. She told me what could not happen without my approval. She told me what paper trails mattered. When I hung up, my hands shook, but my thoughts didn't. Possibility has weight. It takes a moment to get used to. Rachel kept smiling after that. That was the mistake. She thought the game was finished. Daniel kept trusting. That hurt more than anything else. I didn't confront either of them. I waited. I watched. I gathered. Somewhere between the hum of the refrigerator and the house settling at night, I felt the balance shift, just enough to know the story wasn't moving where Rachel thought it was. By the end of the week, I understood what came next. Not revenge. Not escape. Exposure. Slow, careful, unavoidable. I folded the paper and slid it back into the book under my mattress. Before turning out the light, my eyes landed on a photo on the dresser. My husband, younger than I remembered him, standing in front of this same house with his hands in his pockets, smiling like he believed walls meant something. I lay back and stared at the ceiling the way I had so many nights before. Only this time, I wasn't wondering how long I could last. I was counting steps, and I knew exactly where they led. I didn't change anything after that. Not my routine, not my face, not the way I moved through the house. Rachel watched me more closely though. I could feel it. When manipulation stops working, attention sharpens. She asked more questions disguised as concern. Did I remember my appointment times? Had I eaten enough? Was I sleeping better now? Daniel listened from doorways, from the other side of walls, always just close enough to hear, never close enough to interrupt. I started answering carefully, not defensively. Calm has a way of making lies look nervous. The first crack showed up where Rachel didn't expect it. Mail. Not mine, not Daniel's. Hers. I didn't open anything. I didn't touch it. I only mentioned it once, casually, while we were all in the kitchen. Something about a notice coming earlier than usual. Rachel's hand froze for half a second before she laughed it off. Said paperwork was a mess everywhere these days. Daniel shrugged and went back to his phone. But that pause stayed with me. Pressure reveals itself in pauses. I started leaving the house more. Short walks. Small errands. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to be seen. Neighbors nodded. A woman down the street asked if I'd been sick. Said she hadn't seen me in a while. I smiled and said families get busy. That word again. Family. It still carried weight out there, away from Rachel's mouth. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Daniel's number. His voice sounded tight-clipped. He asked if I'd spoken to anyone about finances. I told him the truth, just not all of it. I said I'd asked questions. That I wanted clarity. There was a long silence on the line. Then he said Rachel was worried I felt unsafe. I told him I felt observant. He didn't laugh. He didn't argue either. That was new. That night, Rachel tried something bolder. She laid out pamphlets on the table, highlighted sections, smiled like she was offering a gift. She talked about dignity and comfort and how transitions didn't have to be painful if everyone cooperated. Daniel stood behind her, arms crossed, eyes moving between us. I let her finish. Then I asked one question. Just one. Why every plan involved my consent, but none had ever asked for it. The room went quiet in a way that made sound feel rude. Rachel said I was twisting things. Daniel rubbed his face like he had a headache. I watched him then. Really watched. He wasn't angry. He was confused. Confusion is dangerous when someone else is ready with answers. I didn't push. I thanked them both and said I needed air. Rachel's smile didn't reach her eyes. 2 days later, the truth started leaking through places Rachel couldn't seal. A billing statement she hadn't expected. A date that didn't line up. A signature that wasn't mine. Daniel brought it to me instead of her. That mattered. He asked quietly if I'd seen it before. I said no. I didn't explain. I let the paper speak. His jaw tightened. The team he'd believed in was suddenly standing on uneven ground. Rachel reacted fast. Tears this time. Apologies wrapped in explanations. Stress. Fear. She said she'd only wanted to help. Said she thought I was slipping and panicked. She reached for Daniel's hand. He let her, but his eyes stayed on me. That was the moment I knew the balance had shifted. Not enough to win. Enough to continue. I asked Daniel to sit with me later that night. Just us. I didn't list everything. I didn't accuse his wife. I told him a story instead. About his father. About the house. About promises made when the walls were still fresh. I asked him when protection turned into control. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice cracked in a place I recognized from his childhood. The place where truth starts hurting before it makes sense. Rachel watched us after that like someone waiting for a verdict. She was careful. Polite. Almost respectful. That scared me more than her cruelty ever had. Smart people adjust. That's when you stop improvising and start finishing what you planned. By the end of the week, everything was ready. Documents copied. Timelines clear. Words lined up so they couldn't be bent. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger rushes. I was steady. Whatever came next would happen in the open. With witnesses. With daylight. Before I went to bed, I sat on the edge of the mattress and held the paperback in my hands. All the notes inside it felt heavier now, like they were done becoming evidence and ready to become truth. I didn't know yet how Rachel would fall. I only knew she would. And that when she did, it wouldn't be because I screamed or fought or begged. It would be because she'd built her power on silence, and silence was no longer hers to use. If you're listening to me right now and you've ever felt something shift in a room before anyone said a word, I want to know. Tell me in the comments if you noticed it too, that moment when you realized the story you were living wasn't the one being told about you. Because once you feel that shift, there's no going back. There's only what comes next. I didn't sleep much after that week. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind wouldn't slow down now that it finally had permission to move. Everything I'd gathered sat quietly where it belonged. Copies and envelopes. Notes folded thin from being opened and closed too many times. Truth doesn't make noise when it's ready. It waits. Daniel moved through the house like someone learning a new floor plan. Careful. Watchful. Rachel stayed pleasant in a way that felt rehearsed. Too many smiles. Too many just checking in questions. The house itself felt different, like it had stopped holding its breath. The conversation happened on a Sunday morning. No yelling. No slammed doors. Sunlight coming in through the blinds, dust floating like it always had. Daniel asked Rachel to sit down. His voice was steady, but not cold. That mattered. I stayed quiet. This wasn't my confrontation to lead. Rachel talked first. She apologized again, said she'd made mistakes, said she'd been overwhelmed trying to keep everything together. Daniel listened. He always did. Then he placed the documents on the table one by one. Dates. Statements. Signatures. He didn't accuse. He asked questions. The kind that don't let you escape without choosing a direction. Rachel's words slowed. Her explanations tangled. She reached for concern again, for fear, for how hard it all was. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't take my side out loud. He simply said something I hadn't heard him say in years. This doesn't feel right. The room went still. Not dramatic. Final. That sentence didn't belong to anyone else. It belonged to him. And once it existed, it couldn't be taken back. What followed wasn't revenge. It was resolution. Boundaries drawn without cruelty. Plans made without secrecy. Rachel didn't leave that day, but the house was no longer hers to manage alone. Decisions slowed down. Paperwork shifted hands. Conversations happened with doors open. She became smaller without anyone pushing her. Control loses its shape when it's exposed to light. A month later, Rachel moved out. No scene. No neighbors watching from behind curtains. Just boxes and a quiet goodbye that carried more weight than anger ever could. Daniel didn't chase her. He didn't collapse either. He stood in the driveway and watched the car disappear, then came back inside and sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded like he used to when he was a boy trying to understand something bigger than himself. We talked that night. Really talked. About his father. About promises. About how easy it is to mistake calm for safety when you're tired. He didn't ask me why I hadn't said more sooner. I didn't ask him why it took so long to see. Some questions don't heal. Understanding does. He apologized without being asked. Not with excuses. Just the words. I should have listened. They landed softly, exactly where they needed to. Life didn't suddenly turn perfect after that. Healing doesn't work like a switch. But the house felt like a house again. My mug came back. The chipped one. Daniel fixed the handle with glue and laughed when it didn't quite line up right. We started eating dinner at the table instead of wherever we landed. Small things. Real things. The kind you don't appreciate until they're almost gone. Sometimes I still wake up early and listen to my own breathing. Old habits don't vanish overnight. But now the sound doesn't scare me.